and Mr. David Santiago Cano, Consultant, World Wildlife Fund, and Colombia Ambassador for One Young World. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of council members to document S/2020/239, the report of the Secretary General of the United Nations Verification Mission in Colombia. So I now give the floor to Mr. Ruiz Massieu.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, thank you for the opportunity to present the most recent report of the Secretary General on Colombia. I acknowledge also the participation of Foreign Minister Claudia Blum and Presidential Counselor Emilio Archila, whose continued support to the work of the UN Verification Mission is greatly appreciated. I also welcome today's participation of Mr. Santiago Cano as a show of the Council's interest and support for the role of the Colombian youth, the role that the Colombian youth are playing in the implementation of the peace agreement. Mr. President, as in every country, the COVID-19 pandemic is having a professional impact upon Colombia, and the peace process will undoubtedly feel its effects. However, it is encouraging to see Colombians finding creative responses to the crisis and responding positively to calls for unity as authorities at all levels take measures to contain the spread of the pandemic. Implementation of the peace agreement depends on constant engagement between the parties, as well as key state institutions, civil society organizations, partners from the international community, and others. These engagements is no doubt more challenging in the context of the nationwide quarantine in place since 24th March. Untargeted actions such as the restrictions on access to the former territorial areas for reintegration. But nevertheless, the parties and other actors are adapting in this changing scenario to continue implementing the peace agreement and ensure follow-up on peace-related matters. On 8 April, for instance, the Commission for the Follow-up, Promotion and Verification of the Final Peace Agreement, CCV, met by video conference to discuss the status of peace implementation, including positive results of the work of the tripartite Working Group on Accreditations, which is a mechanism constituted by the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace, FARC, and the Mission. Importantly, the CCV agreed to institutionalize periodic meetings with a special forum on gender and a special high-level forum on ethnic peoples. Also, the working group of the National Reintegration Council have continued to work through virtual sessions, and a dedicated working group on COVID-19 was recently created. The working group on health, which includes FARC, the Agency for Reintegration and Normalization, the Ministry of Health, and the Mission, has taken measures at the national level to prevent the spread of the virus from affecting former combatants and define a protocol to respond to eventual cases. Yesterday, 13 April, the Senate resumed its official sessions virtually, and the Chamber of Representatives is scheduled to do so later today. On 2 April, I participated in the first session of the Senate Peace Commission high-level mechanism to follow up on attacks against former FARC EP members and social leaders and monitor prevention measures. These virtual sessions brought together senators from parties across the political spectrum, including FARC, as well as ministers of government, the Presidential Council for Stabilization, and other high-level government officials, as well as representatives of state institutions. That, in order to analyze the violence affecting social leaders and former combatants, and devise measures to stop it. Also on that date, during a virtual session, the National Reintegration Council approved 3 additional collective productive projects, bringing the total to 52. One of the approved projects is a textile cooperative led by 11 men and 11 women, former combatants, which have begun to produce protective masks for the coronavirus response. 8 additional former combatants cooperatives in other departments have also initiated efforts in this regard. As for the mission, we have also taken measures in line with our business continuity and contingency plans and maintaining our verification tasks in the field in line with the decisions from national authorities. The country team is also developing programmatic support to the government in its response to the pandemic. Mr. President, on this we have to be clear. COVID-19 is and will continue affecting the implementation of the peace agreement and the mission's verification activities. However, we have a collective obligation to continue to ensure progress in its implementation. Peace in Colombia should not be a casualty of this pandemic. In this sense, it is important to continue moving forward with the full implementation of the peace agreement, including on the 3 priorities that the Secretary General highlighted in its latest report. The first priority is to adopt all necessary measures to protect social leaders, human rights defenders, and former combatants. Violence against them continue unabated despite the national quarantine. Since the issuance of the report, 3 more social leaders and 3 more former combatants have been killed, for a total of 195 former combatants since the signing of the final peace agreement. I am particularly concerned by the situation in Putumayo Department, including that of women social leaders, crop substitution leaders, and former combatants. On 19 March, a prominent social leader, Marco Rivadeneira, was killed after he was taken from a meeting he was leading regarding coca substitution efforts in Puerto Asís municipality. 2 weeks later, on 8 April, social leader Yuri Quintero was threatened, presumably by the same illegal armed group that killed Rivadeneira. And another female social leader, Jenny Silva, whom I met last October, continues to be the victim of continuous threats. On 27 March, former combatant Juan Carlos Castillo, who lived in the former territorial area for training and reintegration in that same municipality, was found killed. In a welcome development, in the midst of this worrisome situation, on 9 April, the police captured Abel Antonio Loaiza Quiñones, alias Azul, aka Azul, whom the Attorney General's office holds responsible for the killings and for displacement of 11 social leaders and former combatants in this area. I am also particularly concerned that over the past 2 days, illegal armed groups in Argelia, in Cauca Department, which the Council visited last year, are threatening the population, including former combatants. Mr. President, just as Colombian actors are uniting to confront the pandemic, it is imperative that for all actors to unite to end the epidemic of violence against social leaders, human rights defenders, and former combatants. In particular, it is fundamental to enhance the effectiveness of the mechanisms created by the peace agreement itself, including the National Commission on Security Guarantees, which should make substantial advances in the design and implementation of a public policy to dismantle illegal armed groups. The National Protection Unit, which should advance reviewing over 400 pending requests for close protection schemes, and the Special Investigations Unit, which requires increased support for all entities in order to fulfill its mandate of bringing the perpetrators of these attacks to justice. It is also key to improve security for close to 9,500 former combatants residing outside of former TATRs, including those living in collective reintegration areas. The prompt implementation of the action plan of the comprehensive program for the safeguards of women leaders and human rights defenders is key to ensure protection for women leaders. Second priority is to strengthen the foundations for a long-term reintegration process and ensure that the benefits of reintegration reach all former combatants, regardless of where they live. The consequences of the pandemic make it even more crucial to pay particular attention to former combatants living outside former TATRs, as they have more precarious access to basic services like clean water and sanitation. I also encourage the parties to work within the National Reintegration Council to specifically support collective productive projects that are more vulnerable to the economic consequences of the pandemic. These projects can help reactivate local economies, especially in remote rural areas, which may be particularly affected. It is also important to ensure that the reintegration roadmap is implemented in a collaborative manner between both parties, including for the design of a specific individual and collective roadmaps. Finally, a third priority should be to ensure that communities, especially victims, remain at the center of peace-building efforts. In particular, the current context is an opportunity to undertake planning and consultation to operationalize the comprehensive program for security and protection of communities and organizations in the territories, an important part of Section 3.4 of the peace agreement that, if implemented, can make an important difference on the ground. Mr. President, as the Secretary General highlighted in his report, the sustained and integrated presence of state institutions remain the most effective and necessary means to ensure peace and stability in the territories. In this sense, I am encouraged that Presidential Counselor Archila has continued to coordinate arrangements so that implementation in the development programs with a territorial focus is not affected by the current crisis. I hope that similar measures are being taken in other aspects of the implementation of the comprehensive rural reform and the peace agreement more broadly. Mr. President, echoing the Secretary General's appeal for a worldwide ceasefire in view of the COVID-19 pandemic, and joining numerous voices from Colombian civil society, in recent weeks, I called upon all armed actors in the country to put life above any other consideration and focus on preventing the spread of the virus. The National Liberation Army, ELN, responded by declaring a 1-month unilateral ceasefire during the month of April. However, armed clashes continue between illegal armed groups in several departments, including Cauca, Chocó, and Norte de Santander. At a time when all efforts must be focused on fighting the pandemic, we urge all illegal armed actors in Colombia to desist from continuing to perpetrate violence upon vulnerable communities, including indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities. Mr. President, to conclude, in his Nobel Peace Prize for Literature acceptance speech, Colombian author Gabriel García Márquez said, "Neither floods, nor plagues, famines, nor cataclysm, nor even the eternal wars of century upon century have been able to subdue the persistent advantage of life over death." The resiliency invoked with those words have been seen in the way Colombians continue forging peace in their country after decades of conflict, and in the way they have come together during the last few weeks in the face of the pandemic. I trust that this commitment will continue beyond the pandemic so that the efforts to bring peace and development in conflict-affected communities is strengthened and reinvigorated as a result of this crisis. I am certain that through the constructive dialogue and dedicated efforts of the parties, public institutions, leaders at all levels, and of Colombian society more broadly, we can celebrate in the end the triumph of hope over fear, unity over division, and as Garcia Marquez said, of life over death. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Ruiz Massieu for his briefing, and I give the floor to Mr. David Santiago Cano.
Thank you. Mr. President, members of the Council, for Minister Bloom, Mr. Special Representative, it is a tremendous honor to speak to you today to humbly offer some thoughts regarding the peace process in my country. I cannot claim to speak on behalf of Colombia's very diverse, passionate, and active young population. However, I can speak from my personal perspective as someone who has witnessed the positive transformation of my country as a result of the peace agreement, and who decided to get involved to help the peace flourish. While I'm not a direct victim of the conflict, I believe that all Colombians who lived through the conflict have suffered from the consequences of the violence. I was born in Medellin during the drug-fueled violence of the early 90s, to parents who struggled to support their children, like an average Colombian family. When I was growing up, I remember the neighbors who were killed, the sounds of gunshots, the dead bodies on TV, and the pervasive fear. Because of this common legacy of suffering, I also believe that all Colombians have a responsibility to contribute to that peace that we have wanted for so long. With this belief in mind, when I was 21, I joined the non-profit organization Techo, which mobilizes tens of thousands of youth volunteers to support vulnerable communities, including victims of forced displacement, through the construction of transitional housing and other social inclusion programs. I traveled across the country and heard the hopes and expectations that Colombian youth and conflict-affected communities had for a peaceful end to the conflict. The peace agreement with the FARC-EP fulfilled many of these hopes, but it also raised expectations that violence would finally cease and that peace and development will finally come to rural Colombia. Today, those expectations remain, and all of us must do our part to fulfill them, including by implementing the whole of the peace agreement. Mr. President, in July 2018, I traveled with the UN Verification Mission and a group of young leaders and entrepreneurs to the former territorial area for training and reintegration in Miravalle, Caquetá, to be the first visitors to a tourism project led by former combatants in an area that was at the heart of the conflict for many decades. What I found profoundly moved me. Soldiers who only years before had the responsibility of fighting the FARC-EP were now fully devoted to their new responsibility of protecting their former adversaries. People from the local community were working together with the former combatants to get trained to be tourist guides. And I was very encouraged to hear from the former combatants their firm conviction in the peace process and in building new lives for themselves and their families. Following that experience, I committed myself to supporting former combatants and their local communities with their productive projects. This past December, I mobilized youth volunteers to organize a fair in Bogotá for former combatants to sell their agricultural products and handicrafts, in alliance with the UN, the Agency for Reintegration and Normalization, and several NGOs. It was very inspiring to see people in one of our capital's most exclusive neighborhoods buying products and interacting with former combatants, and all the initiatives surpassed their sales expectations. One of the initiatives was the Sabor La Esperanza coffee from Cauca Department. Sabor La Esperanza means taste of hope, and I'm going to send council members in New York some of this delicious coffee so that you can enjoy these states of hope, peace, and reconciliation. We are now working to replicate that fair in other cities. We also created a program through which young entrepreneurs are mentoring these projects to provide them with technical advice. This is one of many examples of how Colombian youth are working to support peace and reconciliation. Mr. President, I would now like to highlight some of the main challenges that I believe the peace process is facing, based on my conversation and my observations with young people, former combatants, community leaders, and others. First, the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic will take its greatest toll on the most vulnerable. Steps must be taken to support them. The implementation of the development programs with the territorial focus, PEDET, should continue, as communities are awaiting the benefits of this investment. I'm concerned about the productive projects of victims and former combatants. The young entrepreneurs who are mentoring the initiatives from the product fair have reported that the former combatants are struggling because of diminished sales. A strong support of these projects is very important so that they can weather this difficult storm. The mentors are helping them to think of innovative ways of adapting, including online sales and gift certificates and moving to new products. For example, we are proud that the former combatants of the Pasarela Tech Pass clothing project are now producing face masks for the COVID-19 response. Second, the ongoing violence against social leaders continues to be one of the deepest wounds in our national conscience. This is a tragedy that has motivated young people across the country to mobilize in defense of these leaders. I recently participated in several sessions of the national conversation that President Duque launched on the issue of youth. Young leaders from rural areas talk about the intimidation that they are faced, which limits their capacity to be change agents. I was particularly shocked to hear a young Afro-Colombian woman from Chocó department describing how many of her friends do not participate in leadership forums or political spaces because they fear being threatened by illegal armed groups. Measures must be taken to guarantee the protection of young men and women leaders so that brave people like this woman from Chocó don't have to fear for their lives when they are trying to speak up for their communities. Third, when I visit rural communities, I hear a constant complaint that the state is not present. Communities want and need teachers and doctors, roads and school, investment and opportunities. Colombia's geography has historically created sharp division between the cities and the rural areas. Now that the conflict with the FARC-EP has ended, it is an opportunity for this government and all future governments to commit themselves as a priority to bring state presence and investments to these regions. Indeed, it is their duty. In many of these areas, drug cartels and illegal armed groups take advantage of those vacuums to extend their control, including through the recruitment of children and young people. Let me be frank. As long as individuals continue to be using cocaine, including in many of your countries, it is young people and poor people in countries like Colombia who are paying in blood, tears, and suffering. Eradication is not the solution because it leaves poor farmers with little recourse for their livelihoods. The solution is crop substitution and economic opportunities. I have had conversations with coca-growing families, and I can guarantee you, if they are given the right tools and market access, they much rather grow coffee or cacao instead of coca. Finally, as a young man, I'm very proud that Colombia's peace agreement incorporates action to promote women's participation, including support for women leaders and women former combatants. In every single peace building or community effort that I have ever been involved, success has depended on the equal participation of both men and women. All actors must recognize this and make real efforts to implement the gender provision of the peace agreement. Mr. President, distinguished ambassadors, before concluding, I want to thank the Council and the international community for your support to the peace process in Colombia. I thank you on behalf of young Colombians who are now growing up with less fear and more opportunities. Since the peace agreement was signed, I have seen people who were kidnapped by the FARC-EP during the conflict sitting down to talk to former combatants. I have seen police officers and former combatants competing together on the same team in the National Rafting Championships. And I have seen young people from Colombian cities finally getting the chance to visit rainforests that were previously plagued by war. None of this would have been possible without the peace agreement. I thank the Council and the Mission of the Dominican Republic for this opportunity. I hope the Council will continue to invite other young representatives to brief this distinguished body. This is what happened in Colombia, the end of the conflict. In every country on Council agenda, there are young women and men, like me, who are working hard to build peace and who have important contribution to make your discussion. I also thank the UN Verification Mission for promoting youth participation in peace-building efforts, and I thank the Colombian government for holding a national conversation on youth. I'm looking forward to concrete results for these discussions. In particular, I'm grateful for these opens of the Agency for Reintegration and Normalization to work on different initiatives with youth and the excellent results we have achieved so far. Mr. President, as Council members now, the Secretary General has called for a global ceasefire so that all of humanity can unite to fight together against this pandemic. We should not need a pandemic to argue for the silencing of weapons, to focus on the greatest threats to our common survival, from climate change to transnational crime to poverty. This is what happened in Colombia. The end of the conflict with the FARC-EP has allowed us to focus on the structural problems that affect our country. Young people all over the world look to this Council to fulfill your responsibility to promote international peace and security. I urge you all to see this pandemic as a reminder that we are stronger when we are united, and that all of us have a responsibility to accomplish the first goal set in the United Nations Charter, which is, as you know, to save succeeding generation, including mine, from the scourge of war. Thank you.
I thank Senor Santiago for his briefing. This will conclude the live broadcast portion of this meeting.